Hey, welcome to Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Sex is such a controversial topic. With so many different opinions and beliefs out there, it can be really easy to feel shame about sex or really anything related to it. Joining me today is Jeremiah Gibson and Julia Postema, co-hosts of a very popular sex podcast. And today we're chatting all about ways to remove some of that shame from your sexual experiences. This is Relatable, Relationships Unfiltered. Hi, guys. First of all, did I get your last name right, Julia?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, good. Good to know. Tell us a little bit about your podcast. So we've had a lot of guests. We've had a lot of great topics. This one hits a lot closer to home than many that I have explored before. So I don't know if excited is the right word, to be honest, but I am intrigued.
Yeah, that's fair.
Tell us about your podcast, though.
Sure. Our podcast is Sexvangelicals, the podcast that talks about the sex education that the church didn't want you to have. And the language that we use is super intentional. This isn't the sex education that the church missed, that the church forgot about. This is the sex education that the church intentionally excluded from schools, religious systems, and homes, which then deeply and often negatively impact all of us as human beings and sadly set us up to not have flourishing or thriving sexual relationships with ourselves or with other people.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The with ourselves is most certainly a really big point in that, with the very legalistic upbringings, with the very legalistic religions of a lot of shame, because my belief is there's a lot of power in shame. So when we can make somebody feel a certain type of way, that gives a lot of control.
Right. It does. It does. And the control is a huge part of the way that the church negatively impacts folks relationally and sexually.
Absolutely. So I asked before we started recording, but both of you, this is personal experience for each of you that you were raised in what uber religious upbringings. Is that fair to say? Well, how would we say it? How would we describe it?
Uber religious sounds like a great descriptor.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? I would like to hear from each of you what that looked like, and then I'll be happy to share as well.
Yeah, I'll start. So my church experience was a little bit different. The church that I grew up in had a lot to say about gender, actually. There were a lot of messages around what men should do, what women should do. I tell the story that I'm 7 years old in my church Bible study. I am the only boy. I'm the only penis owner in this, in a room full of women who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and a bunch of girls. And we get to the devotional, and the women in the group say, Jeremiah, you're the boy, you're the man, like you have to lead the prayers, you have to lead the songs. And being a good people-pleasing 7-year-old, I did that. That's how I learned early on that men play leadership roles, and that women also take back seats. Women are also expected to be passive. For me specifically, my church group actually was quite silent about sexuality. Julia, you can talk a little bit more about the explicit elements of purity culture and the negativity around sexuality. Right. But silence around sexuality also has its own negative consequences. Because you're still not taught what to do. Sex is still, you still learn that sex is this thing. Well, why is it that we're not talking about sex? Oh, well, we must be not talking about sex because sex is something to be avoided.
Because sex is bad, sex is shameful, and we don't talk about things that are bad and shameful. So,
that's right. That's the implicit message that comes in a system in which you don't talk about sex, which is different, Julia, from a system in which you do talk about sex and you explicitly learn that sex is bad.
Yes.
Yeah. What was that like?
I grew up in a very tiny insular community. The structures that embedded my life were my Baptist church and my classical Christian school, which is a whole other conversation. And then
Oh,
my
yeah.
and then my Christian camp. I graduated with 3 people. So I had very little exposure to the secular world. The secular world to me were called non-believers, non-Christians. So my community used very us-them language. And one of the primary distinctors was that my community was quite vocal about sex and about the purity, particularly the purity of women. So, of course, abstinence only education was foundational to my life. But when we talk about purity culture, that encompasses so much more. That creates a culture of anxiety, fear, and shame in which a person's worth is defined by how well they perform their God-given gender roles, determined by their genitalia, not necessarily by their actual gender. The anecdote that I typically share is that at 8 years old, my friends and I had this conversation about whether spaghetti straps were sinful. And that was a serious conversation. So even as really, really small girls, we knew that our bodies were dangerous, our sexuality was dangerous, and that we were the gatekeepers of not only our own purity, but the purity of the adult men in our lives, even as small prepubescent little girls.
Right. That it is our job to not lead them to temptation, correct? We don't want to
Right.
lead them astray. Absolutely.
Don't want to be a stumbling block.
No, yeah, that would just, heaven forbid. And that, I mean, I can relate to both of what you're describing. That was very much my experience, a lot of that, the purity culture. And I'm wondering, from even a generation standpoint, were your parents like big into that political movement that, and I don't know what year you guys were born, but I mean, I was born in the 80s and my parents were very, born agains as they're called,
Yes.
with very evangelical. And so that it's so fascinating to me when I then research that the political, and not that we're going to get into politics or where anyone stands on it. That's not my point, but what was going on with it at that time and the purpose of it. So the what they were using it for, and sending these messages about sexuality and about Christianity that then our parents were just sheeple and were completely absorbing and completely like, oh, yep, this is how we have to raise our children. And so the legalistic nature of it, the punitive nature of it, really has fucked a lot of us up in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I'm glad that you're making this about generational things. So we were both born in the 80s as well. So my family is 4th, 5th, 6th generation Christian. So they wouldn't consider themselves born again, maybe in the ways that your parents would. But they were still very involved in Republican politics. We were pro-Reagan, pro-Bush, my family. So one of the things that's important about our generation, though, is about Title V and Title V abstinence only until marriage, which is something that passes, which is legislation that passes on a nationwide level during the Clinton administration in 1996, that infiltrates abstinence only education into the public school system. So I actually learned about abstinence only education, not so much from my church, which was silent about sexuality, but from my school system. Which received funding, like many states, like many school districts did during that time, that promoted variations of abstinence-only education. Sex is only to be had in a marital context. Sex outside of marriage has significant risks, kind of the STI fear, kind of building on the AIDS fear that Reagan created in the 80s. So that was the way that I that I experienced it. Maybe Julia in a different way than you and your family experienced it.
Yeah, Julia, do you have anything to add to that? And are you able to relate to that, the born again aspect about your parents?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you know what born again means?
I have heard a little bit about it.
I don't think you do.
Interesting.
So many of the people in my religious community are third, fourth, fifth generation. So my denomination is.
But it isn't about generation.
Oh no, I know.
Okay.
No, I know.
Yeah, so that's your point, though, right? Is that
that's my point? Is that
raised in it?
That's right. Most people in the Church of Christ in the denomination that I was in, like, have been third, 3, 4, 5 generations in, which is different from kind of the born again idea where you fall out of. Actually, tell me a little bit more about born again.
I think you might be confused about what born again means.
Well, I guess I'm leaning kind of to what Jeremiah is describing. That's what are you thinking? What's the context you're putting around it?
Sure. So what I learned about being a born again Christian is that it wasn't about how long your family was embedded in a Christian community. From my Baptist background, being born again was something that every Christian needed to do.
Oh, got it.
So if you weren't born again, then you aren't a Christian.
Got it.
So being born again is repenting of your sinful nature and the desires of the flesh, which of course are anything sexual.
Right.
And then you ask Jesus into your heart.
Yeah,
and then Jesus saves you and you go to heaven when you die.
And I definitely can see it from both.
Yeah.
So exactly what Jeremiah was describing would be how my parents presented, though, in terms of whatever rough upbringings and their rough pasts and all the shameful decisions they made. And I'm not actually saying that, but that was the message that was sent, like all of these things in the past. And now we're born again. And now we're going to make sure that our children are raised in the way of the law and all of those things. And so that was the born again. But then, as you're saying, Julia, that, there's so many conversations around helping people to be born again and bringing people in, even Halloween, right? We would pass out the tracts around instead of candy. Like, you did not participate in Halloween unless you were doing it to give your testimony and all of those things.
Right. And it's actually interesting and strangely relevant that we're talking about the born again piece, which from the Baptist background was about going to heaven instead of going to hell. So I will often describe my growing up experience as revolving around hell and sex, because going to heaven and asking Jesus into your heart and being saved was directly tied to your purity.
Right.
So sex, heaven, and hell are all intrinsically just having a fun threesome together.
They truly, truly are. Yeah. And the school experience you're describing, all of it. How did you guys start to transition out of purity culture? Like, did you guys meet each other while you were both still? Well, I guess let's hear each of your stories in terms of how you evolved out of it.
Yeah. My evolution out was somewhat long. I went to college when I was 17. And even though I went to a Christian college, my background is in social work. Jeremiah and I are actually both licensed therapists, which we didn't mention earlier, but is relevant to the work that we do because we have both personal and clinical experience.
Right.
That being said, when I started my undergraduate program in social work, I started unlearning so many of the messages that I had learned growing up about bodies and race and sexual orientation. Not so much sexuality, but I was unlearning some messages around sexual orientation. But it was really my training postgraduate as a sex therapist that was actually my ticket out of fundamentalism. I had started unlearning some of the core parts of fundamentalism, but the sexuality training was what really actually pushed me completely out.
And we're not like missing the irony of you deciding to become a sex therapist and
right.
Yes.
Yeah. And thinking about generational concerns and family concerns, that has been a massive disruption in my family system, because that represents a falling away or a falling apart from the truth, from eternal salvation.
Right.
Were you still pretty involved in the church when you decided to become a sex therapist? Like, was that?
I was not. I had
Okay.
been moving.
I was, but we'll talk about that in a bit.
I had been
Yeah.
moving out of church territory for several years, but I still would have, to some degree, resonated with the progressive Christian perspective. And
Okay.
I still can appreciate some of that, but I don't participate in any formal religious structures.
Sure. Which is the same way. And I openly say that as well. I believe in God. I believe absolutely in a higher power. I believe in those things. I do not believe in the power and shame that is used to abuse and exploit people based on their deepest fears. So that is what I do not believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeremiah,
I agree.
what was your experience as you navigated out?
Yeah, so therapy is a second career for me. In my 20s, I was a music minister at several different churches. I studied to be a therapist. My background is in systems theory. So learning about systems theory. So systems theory is in summary the idea that everything is connected together, and that there are systems that develop around power, that develop around hierarchies, that make decisions about everything from families to larger things like governments, and there are consistent rules to how systems work. So learning about systems theory was kind of my cognitive move out of the church, and realizing that there was a disconnect between those two, the church paradigm and the systems world paradigm. I tried to have it both ways, though. I moved to Massachusetts. I got hired by another church and tried to, and then stumbled into sex therapy through my office. And for a bit, tried to both be a sex therapist and a music minister. Church wasn't too thrilled with that. I ended up getting fired. I ended up getting kicked out about 4 or 5 years ago, and haven't turned back individually to participating in a church. Although I'm very, very fascinated in the sociology of churches and why people choose religions, and how religious structures communicate particular values about everything from bodies, Julia, what you and I study, to more existential things, to create order, and in a worst case scenario, as we talk about in purity culture, to create control.
Yeah. Yes. So that's interesting. That must have been quite the dissonance you had going on to be that in the church. And then was your angle with sex therapy? And I'm asking this because from my personal, so I was still somewhat, I guess I would say in the church as I started my education in psychology. And so of course it's like founded in, well, I'm going to be a Christian counselor, and I'm going to help people to see it from this perspective.
Right,
and I'm going to, influence them in
Yeah.
all these positive ways. And then I guess probably, as you guys are each describing, the more education I received, the more I realized, I was not going to be a part of abusing anyone in that way.
Right.
But for your experience, did that create dissonance for you as you are doing sex therapy, or were you basing it in like a Christian model, I guess?
I don't know that I was basing it in a Christian model per se. I was fortunate. I went to a graduate school at a Christian university. So Julia, you and I flip-flopped because you did your graduate school at a public school. So I did my graduate school at a Christian university, but one that was able to distinguish between Christian counseling, biblical counseling, and marriage and family therapy. And being able to say what you're doing as a marriage and family therapist, this is not Christian counseling. This is not biblical counseling. So I was fortunate to have been spared kind of that level of enmeshment between the two concepts. I got into sex therapy through an interest in couples therapy. The the immersion into sex therapy was more of like a social justice perspective, and realizing, oh, this church that I'm involved in, they claim to be involved in social justice. Maybe I can kind of help inject and provide some like a theoretical background for how to do social justice work better. The church wasn't interested in that.
Gotcha.
So.
Yes, I would imagine not. How did the two of you find each other, and like how did you make this kind of your niche and what you're doing?
Yeah.
We were both practicing sex therapists at the time when we met in Boston. We met through a mutual colleague, and we were both moving out of other relationships that were more invested in religious community from a formal structural perspective. And I knew that I no longer wanted and I no longer could participate in religious structures any longer, at least the ones that my partner was invested in at the time, my ex-partner. Yeah. So we very quickly bonded over not just our work within sexual health, but the background of becoming a sex therapist following such repressive, restrictive growing up experiences. And sadly, knowing that our experiences were not particularly unique. Our niche as therapists and our niche within our podcast are folks who had some version of what we experienced. And we want to provide what we didn't have that could have saved so much pain, so much heartache. I was a client in sex therapy before I became a sex therapist. So I also know what it's like on the other side of the couch or the desk or the computer these days.
Yeah. Yeah. Jeremiah, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, Julia, how you and I met at the end, and how both of us were in relationships. Prior to this. So I met my ex when I was 18. We started dating when we were 19. That relationship was very entrenched in the church. And one of the things, Julia, that we find in working with couples is that a lot of times couples met in religious contexts, and then they start, it's typically either conversations about sex or race. That begin to be kind of the metaphor that you use, Julia, is the first Jenga block that begins to create a more unsturdy Jenga tower. Sure. And then the more and more Jenga blocks that get taken out. My ex and I did that at completely different paces, and we didn't have a way to talk about that. I don't think either of us were particularly aware that we were doing that in the ways that we were. In the times that we did talk about it, there was so much shame and anxiety that the conversation folded pretty quick. So there are a lot of couples for whom that happens. Right. And we find that moving out of a religious space, which I would argue inherently happens anytime we talk with couples about sexuality, especially from a comprehensive sex education perspective.
Yeah.
Folks have some pretty hard decisions to make.
Right.
That creates a bit of a shock to the relationship. And there are a lot of couples that we know who have made similar decisions to me and Julia, and realize, oh, hey, the relationships that we were formerly in, like those are no longer sustainable. The when we move ourselves out of the religious context, we realize that was actually the thing holding us together.
Right.
And there isn't really anything holding us together anymore, and make the decision to go our separate ways. There's a lot of pain in that. And Julia and I have walked through that individually, and then also with other couples professionally as well. There's also couples who do a lot of really hard work to in the deconstruction process. Deconstruction is the kind of the in vogue term to describe this, to talk about the ways that they're becoming different people, and to maintain a sense of relationship, to maintain a sense of exploration and curiosity in the midst of that, to create something new. What's happened for you and I is like, I got to be the person that I wish that I could have been, that I didn't know that I had permission to be. By moving into a relationship with you.
Thanks.
And getting to practice that, and like being highly motivated to continue practicing that, because I know what it's like to not practice that, to be a less authentic version of myself, one that's more in line with like kissing the asses of religious institutions. That didn't work well for me. And I'm not going back there. I think that you have a similar experience with that too. So yeah.
I think the part to me that is so heartbreaking is the model that I've developed and I use in both individual and couples work that I do is what I call relationship reprogramming. And the premise is that with relationship programming, all of these messages that are sent to us starting pre-verbally by our primary caregivers sets the stage for really what we come to think is normal, acceptable, shameful, whatever it is, but what we come to expect out of relationships. And when individuals are raised with a lot of this very legalistic and the purity culture, but the just these shame messages, they don't realize that they carry them into adulthood. And so for a lot of us, and I don't know what your guys' experience is, but I'll catch myself still, like even with all of the education and the experience and the ability to intellectualize A, B, and C is not shameful. There's nothing wrong with A, B, and C. But then there's the programmed piece of me that has a really hard time. And so it does create a dissonance even for me with some topics present day, because that programming is so deeply ingrained. And that is the part that really breaks my heart for a lot of people, a lot of clients who I sit with who are our age or 40s, 50s and well on, that are not enjoying sexuality in the beautiful, magnificent, passionate way that it can be enjoyed, because they are so tied into their programming still. They are they don't believe that it's okay just to let loose, to enjoy pleasure, all of those things. So I for when I'm working with clients, that's something that I try to stay aware of, is like, what was their programming? And that's exactly what we're talking about. And how is it still holding them back present day, even when we think we are so evolved, right? But it still pops up.
Yeah. My first session in sex therapy with my ex-husband, my therapist, who was a certified sex therapist, asked about our growing up experiences, because that's a great way to begin therapy. And I remember saying, well, I grew up in this really tiny, culty, fundamentalist community, but I don't think it impacted my sexuality all that much. And of course it did. That was actually the most important factor that was negatively impacting my ability to enjoy sexuality the way that I hope we all can.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about that, Liz, I was also thinking about not just how the church encourages people to function as individuals and to think of ourselves as individuals, but also how the church encourages relationships to function as well. Churches encourage enmeshment in relationships.
Yep.
The idea that the two shall become one. But the two shall become one without any sort of like framework for dialogue about how to make decisions and how to make decisions based off of one's individual preferences. So we have to rely then on gender roles and the performance of gender roles, which creates all sorts of unspoken and later spoken types of conflict. But that's also part of the the relationship undoing, or the relationship reprogramming that we've noticed as well, is how do you reconceptualize what it means to be in a relationship in which you two are two separate people. With differences that are worth being celebrated, differences that you can learn from each other, but also differences that allow you to create some distance from each other. Because that's ultimately where sexuality lives. Sexuality doesn't actually live in the closeness that people create. Sexuality lives in the ability to manage the distance between two people and to use that distance to fuel erotic energy to move back and forth.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah. So one of the things that Julia and I have some similar interests around hiking, things like that. but Julia and I also have some differences in like things that we really enjoy. So I play music. I play guitar, and in the times that I do that, Julia, I know that you have communicated how meaningful that is for you to like watch me celebrate, or to watch me do something that's really meaningful and life-giving to me, something that's very different from something that gives life to you. And you see me in a new kind of attractive kind of sense. And I experienced something actually quite similar. Julia is quite the exercise aficionado, running aficionado. Like when you push your body to do things that I'm like, why the hell would you do that? Why would you go to that exercise class? I'm also like wicked attracted to you in those moments. I'm attracted to the ways that you explore those things that baffle me, but that also like draw me closer to you. So in those different activities and being able to celebrate those differences, like we are able to not just conceptually like do that, but also when we come back into the same space, we're able to connect with each other in a different, in a more, I would say a more intimate, more kind of sexual way.
So that interdependency, as you're describing, of one, you are you, I am me, we have a we, but we're, it's not the two become one.
Right.
That because of that uniqueness, the differences, that is what draws us to each other. So more you're saying those things lead to more of the sexuality, like the chemistry and sexuality. But do you see this applied also directly within sexuality? So when you're talking about these differences, how do you see that show up that might lead to, because I could hear a lot of people like, okay, well, and I do hear a lot of people say this,
Yeah.
a lot of clients, like, well, he wants to do X, Y, and Z, and fuck that. Like, that's never going to happen. Or, well, he doesn't want to, try the things I want to try. So sometimes the difference is the lack of, and I know you're not talking about a lack of compatibility here. I just want to really provide clarification as people are listening, that it's more about the novelty, the distinction, the newness of it that leads to the chemistry. How does that become applicable though then sexually?
Yeah, we actually just had a podcast episode about this because you're talking. The example that I was giving was just around generic differences.
Right.
The example that you're talking about though is more around like desire discrepancy.
Yes.
Is the terminology we use in the sex
Right.
therapy world, and ways to help couples to figure out how to navigate that, and recognizing that, first of all, I would be surprised and a little bit intimidated to find someone who has the exact same desires, and also the exact same process as I do for accessing sexuality. Like
Sure.
differences are, one, inevitable, and two, create interest. They create some excitement in the relationship. So when we talk about desire discrepancy, like one of the things that we're talking about is not just desired from the perspective of quantity. So who wants sex more than the other person, but thinking about difference in all sorts of things, from different physical sensations that people might like during sexual activity, different contexts that might help us set someone up for a sexual experience, different accelerators, different breaks, to use Emily Nagoski's language, different relationships with sensations, different relationships with pace. Some people have quicker on-ramps. Some people have longer on-ramps. And to not put labels to those, to not moralize those, but just to acknowledge those as different, and to help. So part of the work then is helping to understand and to celebrate those differences.
And I absolutely agree. And I think that even when people aren't navigating maybe a lot of shame or similar upbringings to what we're describing, this can already exist just from societal views, norms. I mean, because everybody has their beliefs around sex, no matter what their upbringing, even if they were
Right.
raised in ultra liberal or ultra passive or permissive, like whatever the upbringing, everyone's going to end up with a belief system. And then you end up with a partner with likely a different belief system. Or as you're even describing, if it is two partners who have been in the church together for a long time, and now they're trying to figure out what that means, often one person is kind of more ahead of the curve than the other. And this
That's
can lead
right.
to a lot of discrepancy.
That's right.
And so I am curious, when people are coming to you, when a couple is coming to you with two very distinct desires in what they want to do, what they want to try, when it comes to kink, when it comes to outfits and role playing and toys, and what do you do? Where do you start? How do you start to bridge that gap?
I think the first part is being able to explore what desire looks like on an individual level. So if a person is interested in exploring kink, well, what does that mean for that person? And how would they ideally like to explore that? To what extent does that fit within the relationship? And to what extent does that not fit within the relationship? Because just as no partner can meet all of our emotional needs or social needs or any other kind of need, we can't meet all of each other's sexual needs either. So perhaps a person decides that they are going to explore certain fantasies on their own. And that might be in the context of an open style relationship, but it could be in the context of their own fantasy life, their own sexual practices that may or may not involve other people. Yeah. And as much as we're talking about differences, what I often find is that desire discrepancy isn't as big as couples initially think. So sometimes when we're talking about kink, for example, we might get stuck in the actual action of it, the spanking or the flogging or whatever else it is. And that could be really important for someone. But in our work, we try to move away from specific actions or behaviors sexually and to think about the values behind it. So what's meaningful about being spanked? And how else could you access that in the relationship if your partner has a hard no around spanking or something else? So when we can move out of behaviors into values, we can usually find a little bit more commonality. And the church and religious structures really focus on behaviors. The church focuses on abstinence only, not often from a values perspective, but from a punitive, legalistic perspective. And so folks who we see in our practice often haven't considered the values around specific behaviors. And that can be a really important thing to unpack that brings more connection than a couple might initially suspect.
And I think it's also important to distinguish, Julia, between values and morals.
Sure.
You know, that the values are about like what is, so to use your example of flogging, what might flogging help me access about myself? Right. Like that's more in the line of values. Whereas morals, what the church does is that it deems it bad. It deems it evil. It deems it sinful. And so to answer part of your question too, is as sex therapists, we have to help couples remove language of bad, remove language of sinful, remove language of evil kind of out of the sexual vocabulary that we might use, being aware of disgust and being empathetic towards that, but also deconstructing some of the messages that might lead to disgust and helping to kind of push that out of the relationship. Of course, knowing that there's also a difference between bad, evil, and I do want this and I don't want this. Right. We're absolutely respecting the do wants, don't wants. Yeah. But if we begin to put a diagnostic, bad, evil kind of gross, that kind of language, we want to do whatever we can to put the stop sign up on that.
Yeah, and the boundaries are so important when we are navigating out of shame around sexuality, because as you described, there are not a lot of boundaries in the type of upbringing we're describing, and that's the enmeshment piece.
Right.
We as
That's
children
right.
are not allowed boundaries, and even the couple is not allowed boundaries. Everyone should have access to everything at any time, and there's not space for that. And so it's important, as we're figuring out this shame piece, is twofold. What you guys are describing is that, first of all, why are we labeling it the way that we are, and digging
Right.
into understanding where does that label come from. Also, what's the bigger meaning that is here? What are some different perspectives that we can look at whatever the act is, or whatever component of sexuality? What are various perspectives that we can consider? But then, a big part of also removing that shame beyond the perspectives and is how your partner is then, like, the messaging they're giving you, which I think can become difficult in these type of situations, because as you guys are describing, if something is sinful or disgusting and that message is coming from your partner, that's really hard to change your own messaging around it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How do you guys help to really start to shift the shame messages? So when you're doing this work, what are even a couple, with people listening, and they're probably really relating to a lot of this, I would love to give a couple solid takeaways of, if your desire is to start to shift out of shame around sexuality, what does that look like?
Well, from a communication standpoint, shame often gets communicated through criticism.
Yeah.
Either criticism of the other person, or more dangerously, I could even say, criticism towards self.
Right.
And so one of the things that is helpful is, criticism is not helpful in any sort of situation. So figuring out how to kind of pair off the blaming comments that begin with "you are," "you do," anything that begins with "you," typically speaking, leads in the direction of criticism. And to find, in general, from a relationship standpoint, to find more positive ways to talk about each other, and then also to talk about yourselves. So finding spaces for appreciation, for admiration, and ultimately, kind of a deeper level is, I tell folks that a criticism is a failed attempt to get a need met. So understanding, okay, when you're criticizing someone, okay, what is the need that you're actually trying to communicate about yourself?
Right.
And can we make it about your own need as opposed to your partner's behavior?
Right. And being aware of the critical things that might be said in bed that aren't
That's
even,
right.
a partner might suggest something and like, oh, that's weird. Why would you want to do that? Or where'd you even hear of that?
Yep.
Or
The
like
disgust
immediately
response.
is going to shut somebody down. And so I think that being aware of how are you presenting, how are you staying safe for your partner when they are bringing something up, it does not mean you have to engage in it. It does not mean you have
That's
to
right.
agree to it, but also you can explore it, and you can just be open to it in the sense of open to it in conversation, even if you're not open to it with your body.
Right.
Absolutely. And shame fosters in secrecy, just like a petri dish. So in unlearning some of the shame, the first part is being able to name it and to hopefully talk about it in contexts that are safe, whether that is with a supportive partner, with a friend, with a therapist, or in some other kind of supportive setting. Mm-hmm. So often we want the shame gone without unpacking it. And so after we identify what the shame is, we've got to do the work around, like you said, where did that come from? Who was the first person who said that to me? How did that get reinforced? And then from there, be able to consider, what might I want differently for myself? I received this value around sexuality. What are some other stories that could be present? And to think more about creating space for other stories than trying to just get rid of the shame.
Yeah, agreed. And I think also asking yourself, what is the what is the purpose that the shame in and of itself is serving?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right.
Because for a lot of us, that shame served as protection. Like
Right.
if I'm able to shame myself and keep myself in check, then I don't have to deal with these consequences. And these consequences can be anything from a really scary parent to going to hell, as you described. And so a lot of times we use that shame as a protective mechanism because we believe that it is keeping us safe from things that can harm us or the consequences of that. Where in fact, that is all part of the fucked up narrative as well, because like that's not, those choices around sexuality are not necessarily going to take you to hell. They are maybe just going to take you to a great orgasm, which
Yeah. Amen.
All right, you guys, where can people find more about you? Where your podcast, website, stuff like that?
Yeah. Sexvangelicals is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We are also online, www.sexvangelicals.com. We're on Instagram and Threads at Sexvangelicals. And we also have a Substack called Relationship 101 that you can find at sexvangelicals.substack.com.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me and for sharing your stories and listening to mine. And it's always nice to be able to find somebody who can just really like normalize and connect on such a hard topic, such a painful topic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank
you so
Thanks for
much.
your
This was a
comments and questions
delight.
too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Jeremiah and Julia, for helping us to take the shame out of sex. And thank you all for hanging out on Relatable Relationships Unfiltered. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for my newsletter, and find me on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick.
This is Relatable Relationships Unfiltered.